Hello designers, I'm going to show you guys some tips and tricks to pass the ACA Photoshop certification test for the 2020 version. I recently took the 2020 version of the ACA Photoshop test and I scored a 925, which I think is a pretty decent score considering the highest available score is 1000. And I'm going to show you guys today how you can achieve a similar score when you take your certification test. I'm going to be opening several different images that I prepared for this video specifically. If you don't have the images because you're not my student, don't worry because you can try to follow along to the best of your ability using any image that you downloaded from a copyright-free stock site such as Pixabay or Pexels, just so you can try the techniques out. Before we go and start opening any images, however, I want to show you guys how to create a new document using the presets you're going to be asked to use when you take the Photoshop certification test. So with Photoshop open, I'm going to click Create New. And at the top, you'll see that there are several different presets depending on the output of your final design. So I'm going to select Web because I recall very distinctly being asked a question that was asking me to create a document that was going to be featured on a website. If I click View All Presets, I'll see several different more options depending on the kind of monitor that the design is going to be viewed in. Right now I'm just going to leave Web Most Common and I'm going to go and title the document. Now you'll usually go and title whatever they're asking you for in the test, so if they don't include a title, then don't write in a title. But in this case, I'm just going to assume they want me to call it Web. So that's what I'm going to type in. And then I remember distinctly that they wanted you to not necessarily play around with the width or height or the resolution. So I'm going to leave the default settings. But they did want me to go and change the bit. If I go right here where it says 8-bit, I can go and select different bit sizes that the actual document will be viewed in. So I think I'm going to select 16 bits and then click Create. Okay, and that's my document so far. If they ask you to do something further in that particular question, then you do so. If not, move on and go to the next question. One of the questions you'll be asked to answer when you're doing the simulation questions is to modify the metadata status on a document in Photoshop. The metadata refers to information that is embedded within any given document. It includes copyright and contact info. So one of the things that they ask you to do on the certification test is to change the status of a document to copyrighted. To do so, we would go to File, and we would go to File Info. Took me a few minutes to figure out where it was. Under copyright status, you can see right now for this image it says unknown, but if we go and click the drop down menu, we can select whether the image is going to be set to copyrighted or set to the public domain, meaning anybody can use the image for any purpose in education. We're just going to leave it at copyrighted and we're going to click OK. If in the question in the certification test it asks you to set the image to public domain, then that's what you set it to. One of the questions you can also expect to see on the certification test is questions having to do with typographic layers. So here I have one layer titled Desserts, and you can see that each of the letter forms in Desserts is really spaced apart, whereas each of the letter forms in the word Drinks is very close together. So what I want to do is I want to match the tracking in Drinks to the one in Desserts. I want to give it a more spaced out look. So the first thing I got to do is I got to enable that Desserts layer and find out what the tracking or the space in between each letter form is. To do so, I'm going to go and click on the Type tool and then find the character panel. You can either look for this little A icon on the side of your panel, so you can click right here in your options bar when your horizontal type tool is selected, or you can go under Window and Character. One of the things that I found very easy about the 2020 certification test is that they are not necessarily just enabling some hotspots on the Photoshop screenshot. Instead, they're actually going and loading Photoshop through a cloud-based software, and it gives you the ability to use any of the tools and panels that you would if you had the program open in front of you as well. So anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and click with the type tool inside of the layer that says desserts, and I can see the tracking is set to 400 here. So I need to go and set drinks to 400 as well. So I'm going to click on the drinks layer, highlight that word, and then in the character panel under tracking, I'm just going to go and type in 400 and click enter. By the way, if you're not necessarily familiar with any of these panels, you can go and just hover your mouse over any of the icons and it will tell you the name of each and every one of the tools in those panels. So for example, if I hover my mouse over VA, it's going to tell me set the tracking blah blah blah, which lets me know that's where I can adjust the tracking on any given type layer. Speaking of text layers, I do remember distinctly a question that was asked where I had to apply a moss style to a text layer. The styles are basically a collection of different layer effects that somebody created and documented as a style, so it's easier to go and apply that exact same style on any other image or layer that you have open in Photoshop. To go and locate the styles, if it's not already listed in this configuration of panels right here to your right hand side, you can go under Window and Styles. The one that they asked me for was called Moss, so it's pretty much stands to reason that it would be found under the folder called Natural. What you'll have to do is make sure that particular layer is enabled. So I only have one layer, so I only have one thing to work with, but once you go and find that style, you're going to click on it and you'll see all of the effects that went into making that style are going to now be listed underneath the layer. If you don't know what style it is necessarily, you can go and drag your mouse over each of these little thumbnail and it's going to tell you the name of the style, so it's going to make it easier for you guys to locate and apply the style to the layer. On the topic of styles, I do recall a question that asked you to copy the layer styles on a text layer and apply those same exact styles to a separate text layer. So here you can see I created a sample graphic, and you can see that the word cookies is very three-dimensional, has that really nice gradient applied to it, but the word yummy by contrast is pretty plain. So what I want to do is I want to copy these same exact effects that I used on cookies to yummy. To do so, all I have to do is right-click on the cookies layer, and then I'm going to select Copy Layer Styles. Then I'm going to click on Yummy, and I'm going to select Paste Layer Styles. And you can see that those exact same styles were basically added to the word yummy with very little effort from my part. Okay, let's talk about selections, because I do very distinctly remember questions in the certification test that had to do with creating selections, copying and pasting the selections onto different layers, using selections as a means of creating a non-destructive mask, and one question specifically which asked to create a selection and then use the content-aware method so that we could fill that selection with something else. So let's tackle some of those questions here. One question specifically asked me to select the image and then paste that selection onto a new layer. It didn't necessarily ask me for any given selection tool, at least not that I recall. So I'm just going to go and use my magic wand tool here, just because I have a very plain white background and it's going to make it easier for me to use magic wand to try to get rid of that, background here. So I just click with the magic wand tool on the background and I can see it did take in some parts of the dog, so I can easily go and fix that using my quick selection tool, holding down Alt to go and delete those parts of my selection. Now mind you, if in the certification test it tells you to use quick selection, or it tells you to use lasso or whatever, that's the tool you're going to use. But if it doesn't tell you, then you have free reign to decide which selection tool to go and complete the task you're asking for. Now, what I want to do is I want to go and make a selection of the puppy, but right now I can see I have a selection of the background layer, which is not what I want. So what I'm going to do is go to the select menu and inverse that selection. So now the selection is around the puppy, and I know I have a selection because I see the marching ants. Now what I want to do is I want to place the selection of the puppy on a separate layer. One way to do it is to use the shortcut Control-J, and it's going to go and place that selection on a separate layer, as you can see here. The checkerboard background basically just means transparency, in case you're unaware of that. Previously, you were unable to go and use shortcuts, but I used a shortcut while taking the certification test with no problems whatsoever. So I'm going to encourage you guys to also use shortcuts if that's going to make your life easier and help you finish each of the questions faster, because remember, it is a timed 50-minute test. Another question you may be asked will be to use a mask to go and eliminate some part of the sky using the masking technique. So this is where using a selection tool really helps to just go and make the masking faster. So here what I want to do is I want to select the sky again, because I just want to keep the puppy, right? So I want to create a mask that goes and hides the sky and retains the puppy. So again, I'll be using my good old friend, the magic wand tool, so I can try to get as much of the sky as possible. I can see I did a fairly decent job, but I wanted to do a little more, so I'm going to go to select and similar. And I can go and fix up the areas it didn't fully select by switching over to my quick selection tool and just going and adding to those areas in the selection. Then, with that selected, I could theoretically click on the mask, but if I do so, it's going to reveal the sky, not the puppy. So I'm going to inverse the selection by going to select and inverse. And now that I have the marching ants around the puppy itself, I'll click on the layer mask icon, and you'll see that now it masks out the sky and it reveals the puppy. If the test is asking me to refine the mask, like going in and refining the edges so that it doesn't look necessarily like it's been cut out with scissors, then that's what I'll do. But if that's not on the test, then don't worry about it, just move on to the next question. I can tell you for certain that I saw a question which asked me to use the content-aware method. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I want to try to eliminate the yacht behind the couple here. And I want to use content aware to help me do that. Now I wouldn't want to use content aware move tool or anything like that, because I want to eliminate the boat. I don't want to, move it elsewhere. So one area that I eliminated was using the lasso tool to just go and create a very rough selection of the damaged area, but in this case again I'm just doing the boat. And then I went to the edit menu and I selected fill, and then under contents I selected content aware and clicked OK and let Photoshop process the image. Okay, so you can see it did a pretty decent job, except for it eliminated some of the woman's hair, and there's areas where it tried to sample the colors in the ocean, but it just didn't work out so well. But that's okay, I'm not really going to worry about that. On the test itself, I didn't see any weird areas that would be cause for concern. Again, this is just practice, so if you see an area that you're just not perfect or not up to your standards, don't freak out, because on the test they're not necessarily going to ask you to refine those problem areas. They just want to know that you can do the task they're asking for. Let's spend a little more time talking about layers. I do recall specific questions that asked me to hide certain layers, to modify certain layers for non-destructive editing, and lastly to group layers as well. If your layers panel is closed, you're going to toggle it open by clicking on the layers within your panel's selections here. Now here, what I want to do is I want to hide specific layers within this document. So on the certification test, they might ask you to identify, for example, the text layers and hide the text layers, or to identify the image layers and hide the image layers on your document. So you have to know exactly what layers you're looking at. And the first thing you got to do is actually open the layers panel and see what you got to play around with. So I see I have in this document 2 shape layers for the elephant and the camel, and I can identify them as shape layers because they have this little icon with a bounding box on the corner. And then I also have 2 text layers, and those are easy to identify because they're basically a capital T. So on the certification test, you might be asked, for example, to hide the text layer. So to hide any layer, you would just go and click on the little eyeball icon next to the layer name, and it's going to hide the layer. So it's not necessarily that you're deleting them or cutting them off from the image or anything like that. You're just hiding them for a little bit. Another question specifically asks me to modify a layer so that I could then apply filters non-destructively to that layer. That basically is asking you to convert that layer into a smart object, so that if you go and apply filters to that image, all the filters are going to be listed underneath the layer and you'll be able to make changes as you need to. To create a smart object, all you have to do is right-click on a layer and select Convert to Smart Object. Once Photoshop converts that image into a smart object, and you can identify it as a smart object because it's going to have this little icon on the corner of the thumbnail, any edits that you create onto that image are going to be non-destructive. Meaning, for example, this wasn't in the certification test, but I want to show you what I mean. If I were to go and blur out the image, and then I changed my mind later on, I could just go and toggle the visibility of that layer filter, that smart filter, anytime, or I could just delete it altogether. So that's what they're talking about as far as non-destructive editing goes. The question that I saw on the certification test did not ask me to apply a filter, but rather to prepare the image for filters. So that's basically all I had to do, was convert the image to a smart object. Lastly, I want to go over how to group layers. I do recall another question that specifically asked me to take layers that were not grouped and create a new group out of them. So here you'll see that in this document I just have a group called backgrounds. I'm just going to toggle the visibility of that off so you can see what's underneath it. And then underneath it I have the words desserts and that brownie image. So assuming that they want me to go and group any ungrouped layers in my document, I would just first need to go and select them. So I would go and select desserts, and I would select the image by holding down Shift on my keyboard, and that's going to allow me to select multiple layers simultaneously. Then I would go and group these 2 layers by going to this little folder icon at the bottom of the layers panel, and that creates a group. More than likely, they're going to ask you to name that layer. So to name the layer, you just have to go and double click and then name it. So I'm just going to call it dessert. If they're asking you to play around with the stacking order, meaning which group of layers is on top and which is below, all you got to do basically is click and then drag until you see those lines those blue lines, which means that you're putting something on top of the other in the layers panel. Okay, so that's it. Those are my tips and tricks so that you guys can succeed in the Photoshop 2020 version of the certification test. Hit me up with any questions in the comments below, and I wish you all the best of luck as you guys pursue your certification. Peace out.